And that's what I deal with. You have to realize that sense perception is not truth. Sense perception gives you a very defective, inadequate approximation of what the universe is like. And you have to start with that assumption at some point and say, well, we've got to be free of sense perception. We cannot deduce from sense perception. And anybody who tries to deduce from sense perception will come to, if they're honest and competent, they'll come to the point and say, well, I don't know. We're only guessing. We don't know. We don't know, not just in terms of measurement, we don't know ontologically, which is more important, which means that the belief in sense perception is a defective ontology. And our problem is to find the particular cases which are unique, which contradict that kind of ontology. And you look at the question of what the human mind can do in discovery. Now, one thing you have is where music comes in, where the so-called classical form from Bach in particular comes in, but it's already been there before. What you're demonstrating is that there's a principle which stands outside so-called sense perception, which produces an effect which you cannot attribute to sense perception as such. Now, what this happens is in terms of science, in terms of physical geometry, physical economy. It's very clear. You cannot rely on you cannot rely on those measurements for physical economy, which is what most people do. So we're living in a defective system where people believe in sense certainty. They go out and try to measure the economy, measure things relating to the economy in terms of sense certainty. My knowledge is that's all crap. For example, virtually every economic forecaster, of which I have knowledge of who's had any prominence, has been incompetent. They're intrinsically incompetent because they believe in deduction which works within the framework of sense perception. And now most of them are even cruder than that. They just take the sense perception idea. They don't forecast the future. They can't forecast the future. I've been at this since 1954. And 57, that whole period, in forecasting. And in my entire experience in forecasting, I have never seen a systemic approach to forecasting which was competent. None. And I've always been, right in when I made a forecast, because I don't make forecasts on everything, but I only make forecasts when I can grab one, when I can grab the facts that I say, this proves something. And therefore, what that means that the problem here, and the problems of physicists and others in this, is they believe in proof of the deductive proof by experiment. And that tells you the past. And that shows you a very systemic defect in their minds. The human being differs from the animal, is that we are capable of reacting to the future. The typical person believes that you can get the truth only by reacting to the past experience, and that's the difference. The difference of the human being from the animal is the human being is capable of seeing the future. The animal is not. The animal can only foresee what is built into the present structure of physical actions and sense perception. The scientist, who's truly a scientist, works on only the basis of discovering things that were not known by direct experiment, simple experiment.
I mean, the Einstein speed of light case is just fascinating, because in trying to understand this, you couldn't do it in absolute space and time.
I think you have some reactions to, first of all, to my dear friend, Riemann. Yeah. And it's a Riemannian approach, which is used by Planck, and Planck's work then correlated actually with Einstein's experiments. And this resulted in a view of the universe. And that view was defeated as being official through the empiricists during the course of World War I, and into especially a vicious campaign to destroy science, which has run in the name of science in the 1920s. And that's what the problem is. That if you cannot, mankind's specific ability which enables us to get out of the bounds of sense perception are two. First of all, as in classical music, you get an expression which is unique of the future. And this is one of the only ways it gets. And you take the whole musical system of Bach, from Bach on, that's exactly what you have. You have a future system. It's based on the future experience of what is going to happen. Therefore, it's why we call that creative, because it shows you and demonstrates to you experimentally something that exists only in the future. But you know it exists in the future. You know what the future is in that degree. The typical person says you've got to give up this fantasy about the future. You've got to go by the hard facts and do a projection from these so-called hard facts into the future. In other words, you've got to say, well, we know we can use clocks. We can measure time in clocks. But we can't measure changes in the physical system by clocks. But we can know the changes in the physical system. For example, when we use energy flux density in the space and so forth as a measurement of processes, we are capable of seeing the future. That's precisely what we do with that kind of experimental work. We are looking at the future. We're taking the physics of the present, and to the extent that you can see the future of where the experiment is going, you know the future. But if you say, I've got to prove this on basis of past experience, you don't know the future. You know the past experience. And that's what our problem is. And every economist that I've seen in forecasting has failed precisely for that reason. They say you have to have a deductive proof of what has happened, and then you can project from that a future. And in my experience, in critical matters, that is always a failure. Every usual kind of so-called leading forecaster is absolutely incompetent and fails all the time, unless they pick a subject which is irrelevant. That's always a good way to do. But in general, all the official accepted teachings of economics in particular and related things is incompetent intrinsically. What this shows, of course, is that at the same time that sense perception is not a reliable instrument. And therefore you have to go to certain contradictions, as Kepler did and others have done in science. You look at things which are not possible on the basis of past experience and find out principles which demonstrate what something is true. And that becomes the basis for science. All forecasting depends upon the ability to project the inevitability of a future, because it's already happened. This takes you out of the domain of ordinary deduction, absolutely out of it. And that's what you depend upon. Creativity, which is making the future without advanced evidence of what it's going to be from a deductive standpoint. Deductively, the future does not exist. And no one can predict the future honestly if they're completely deductive, because they can never get out of that prison. They have to wait for the event. We proved it, I was guessing and we proved it. We were lucky, right? That kind of nonsense. But if you really are, as I've done for years in this kind of thing, is exactly, forecasting is my lifestyle. You can define what the future means, and that's a little bit different than predicting what the future is going to be. It's understanding that there's a future there, and the future has certain pressures in it which you can experience. You cannot always exactly foresee what the consequence is going to be, because other factors will change. But you are actually operating in the future rather than doing deduction on the basis of experience today.
That's exactly